Right, I think that's showing. So I'm sorry, I'm the only thing standing between you and a good cup of coffee. So I'll try and keep it short. And this talk should have been presented by Najla, my PhD student, but due to family problems, she can't be here today. I hope she's online. I'm not sure whether she is yet. So I'm her PhD supervisor. I'm an HCI and cognitive psychologist person. And Sia is our cybersecurity expert and her advisor. And I won't try and explain what an advisor is. I'll tell you over coffee. So we're going to talk about online security attack experience and worries of young adults in the UK. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that we're living in a more and more online world with lots of security threats. And there's some researcher that you've probably never heard of who's done lots of research on this area and inspired us with the conclusion that people are aware of security issues, but tend to lack the skills of how to deal with them. And that research goes back over quite a period of time. Oops. So what about the young generation now? So we now have what the mass media like to call Generation Z. We probably have some of you in the room, people who are now in their 20s, who are the first generation of people to grow up totally in a digital world. So they were born typically, the ones who are now about 30, they were born just as the internet was born, well, not the internet, sorry, the World Wide Web as we know it, and were quite young when smartphones became available, which I think was also very important. So at the moment, we have somewhat inconsistent, excuse me, research about the effect of age on perceptions of online security problems. And there's evidence both in terms of online security, but also in terms of psychology in general, that younger people, particularly young men, tend to take more risky behaviors. So are they being risky in terms of online security as well? So we decided we would focus on this generation. And this is Najla's first study for her PhD. So it's quite an exploratory study, but we're interested in how worried are people who've grown up in this new environment about online security? Are they unrealistically optimistic? So Spiros mentioned that yesterday. That's a concept we're very interested in. Do they think it's not going to happen to them? It's just going to happen to other people. And therefore, how much experience do people actually have of real security risks and threats? Is it just something they hear about, or have they experienced it themselves? And how does that experience affect them? So as you see, that's a lot of questions, only some of which we'll address in the data today. And our longer term goal is to create support for people, how best to support people in managing online security risks or threats. So this was done during the COVID pandemic. So an online survey was the obvious research method. And I was very concerned, particularly because Sia and Najla kept on talking in terms that I did not understand as an old psychology person, that we create materials that would be understandable by everybody. So not talk about the technical terms, ransomware or whatever, but talk in terms that everyone would understand. So we created 12 scenarios, also known as vignettes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And we did a lot of work with frameworks of online security and creating a range of scenarios that would cover the typical range of threats that people might have had experience of or heard about in very non-technical language. We also asked 9 questions about how worried they were about different online security threats. Later, I realized we could have just asked about how worried they were about the 12 scenarios. I'm not sure why we didn't do that, but when you're in the heart of research, obvious things don't occur to you. So they were separate questions. An example of one of the scenarios, all the scenarios are in the paper in the proceedings that you can read, is I click on a link on a website or in social media or in an SMS, and then notice my device acting strangely, e.g. the device freezes, runs slowly, or crashes repeatedly. I realize this may have been caused by clicking on the link. So there's no technical language. And people were asked, and this was emphasized in the instructions, whether they'd had something like this happen to them. So it didn't have to be exactly the same. And we asked them to describe an example of what had happened to them, but we asked them to rate on a 7-point Likert scale that it had never happened to them or it had happened many times on that scale. We also asked them for each scenario a number of other problems, like what device it had happened on, where, was it on a link or was it in an SMS, and particularly what they did to try and resolve this, what the consequences were and what they did to try and resolve it. We're not presenting those data here today because there's a lot of data. We're just concentrating on that first question about had something like this happened to them. And we counterbalance the order in which they saw the 12 scenarios to avoid practice and fatigue effects. And I'm afraid there's a really stupid typo in the paper that it doesn't say, has something like this ever happened to you? There's an extra word, which I was really irritated, and it's my fault. So, but I think you'll understand what we mean. We also did brainstorming around 9 worries statements that we also asked people to rate their agreement or their level of worry on a 7-point Likert scale. You will discover, if you look at my research, I am the absolute queen of the 7-point Likert scale. And these statements are in the paper as well. And it's things like, someone will steal my online identity and misuse it. So we also ask people to rate their general computer knowledge, their online security knowledge, and their confidence in their ability to detect an attack from a cyber criminal. Again, on 7-point Likert scales, there are only single questions, which, it's not the greatest thing, but this was a first exploratory study. And we asked for demographic information. We actually also gave people 2 of the well-known security scales, the CBIS and the HAISA, and you can expect a different paper on that because we're collecting more data to do proper statistical analysis on those. So we recruited people via Prolific, which is it's like Mechanical Turk, but it's specifically to recruit people who are interested in research. I actually think they probably nicked the Mechanical Turk business model and then put it for research. So people were paid £2. We recruited 84 people, but 3 of them failed attention check questions that we had, so they were thrown out. So we end up with 81 people. They're aged 18 to 30. One of the good things about Prolific is you can specify the age range that you want, and you can also specify their nationality and where they're living. So they're all people who say they're British, whatever that may mean, living in the UK. They're pretty well educated, and clearly people who sign up to Prolific are not a random sample of the population. They're people who are interested in research, and they're probably reasonably computer literate. So I would say if these people are having problems, then everyone's having problems, because these are these are your people who should know what they're doing here, but we're not saying it's a representative sample. Sadly, we had a question asking people's gender, and at some point in developing the materials, we must have deleted it because we don't know people's gender, but Prolific gives you a gender balanced sample. So sadly, we can't analyze for gender, but we're pretty sure it's a gender balanced sample. So the first thing of interest is that this group of people rate themselves as significantly having good computer knowledge, good online security knowledge, and being confident. So all those ratings are significantly above the midpoint of the scale. Again, it's not surprising because this is a well-educated, computer literate sample, but are they being unrealistically optimistic about their knowledge here? So this is kind of going backwards in the results, but we took the 9 worries statements and we did a principal components analysis, which is like a factor analysis, but it doesn't assume normal data because almost always rating scales are not normally distributed. And we got the best result I think I've ever seen. And I've been teaching statistics and doing statistics for 20 or more years, that over 70% of the variance in the scores could be accounted for by 2 components, and all 9 questions load onto one of those 2 components. And we've got plenty of data. Typically, you need 5 to 7 times the number of items. The number of participants should be 5 to 7 times the number of items. We've got nearly double. So that was a really good result. And the 2 components which come out are a worry about data and identity theft. That's the clearest one and produces the highest scores. That's not in the paper, but it's true. And a lesser one is a worry about phishing, particularly spear phishing. That only accounts for 13% of the data. So then our first hypothesis, if you like, is that people who are more worried, you might expect to be less knowledgeable, less confident. I mean, you can run this argument both ways, actually, but it's interesting to see what relationship there is between people's self-reported confidence and knowledge, admittedly only on 1 question each, and these rather robust components, I would say. And there's no relationship whatsoever. Doesn't matter whether you're very confident or not at all confident about your ability to detect them, to detect security threats. That does not relate to your level of worry. Kind of interesting, but doesn't get you very far. So looking at the scenarios, which is our main focus of the study, participants had a considerable experience of the scenarios. We couldn't fit all this in the paper. I think someone yesterday mentioned the difficulty of getting what you want into a 10-page conference paper. So this is a bonus that's not actually in the paper. But all the scenarios were experienced by at least some of the participants. However, not all the participants had experienced 1 or more scenarios. So in terms of participants, we had 4 participants who said they'd never had any of these things or anything like them, up to 1 participant who said they'd had 9 of the 12 scenarios, so they're having a lot of security threats. And the average was 3 scenarios per person, or the median. The most frequently experienced were the 2 that related to spear phishing, scenario 10 and scenario 11, if you want to look in the paper, with over half the participants having experienced scenario 10 and 40% or so scenario 11, with over 10% of the participants saying they'd experienced them many times in each case. So that's interesting. And the least frequent was the ransomware, which only 3 participants or 12% had experienced. So we then took 2 measures from this Likert scale. One was, had they ever experienced anything like this? So this is if you give more than the never rating, and you've got 12 scenarios, so that gives you a score between 0 and 12. And then if you have experienced, how much have you experienced it? So perhaps my thinking here was, if you'd experienced something once, that may not have a big effect on your concerns, but if you experience something a number of times, then your worry about it might increase. So here we did a correlational analysis. For the number of scenarios you'd experienced, we just did Spearman correlations with the 2 worry components, it's not factor analysis. And we got significant correlations with both. So the more different scenarios you'd had experience of, the more you were worried about both data and identity theft and about phishing. And then we did linear regression on how often, how many times you'd experience things. You get approximately the same result. It's not quite as clear on the theft component, being worried about data and identity theft. You get an overall linear regression probability of 0.06. And even though I've taught statistics for over 20 years, I've never been able to figure out why probabilities have to be below 0.05. And every year my students ask me and I say, I don't know, it's just tradition. So, and there are a couple of scenarios which are most important in that prediction on both components. I think you'll have to look in the paper, I've forgotten that. So, this is beginning to explore this data set for Najla moving forward in her PhD. What we seem to have found so far is that Generation X people, this not representative sample, seem to be confident in their knowledge and confident in their ability to detect online security threats, but they are worried, and those worries seem to fall in 2 areas, data and identity theft and spear phishing. They have considerable experience of these threats, which I thought was interesting. We haven't yet started to explore what are their skills. So this is their worries, the first part of Steve's conclusion. We do have some data in this data set about their skills, because we asked them how did they try and resolve this security threat when they had it, which won't be perfect, but we'll be able to start to look at their skills. And we found that any experience of security threat increases the level of worry, and more experience increases it more. So future work, we've got a lot more analysis to do on this data set. We are also investigating a cross-cultural aspect, because Najla is from Saudi Arabia, so we've actually run the same study with people in Saudi Arabia, which we're analyzing at the moment. Obviously, it would be interesting to compare this data with the same data from older people. I will probably do that as a separate study. And as a cognitive psychologist, I'm always a little suspicious and cautious about pure self-report data. It's a good start, and in the pandemic, what else could we do? But Najla is now going to go on and do 2 studies where we get much closer to real data. One will be really collecting real behavior from people, and I think the other is we're going to ask people to keep a diary over a period of time using a technique that you may have heard of, experience sampling method, where you just ask people specific questions to get more higher quality self-report data. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.